Hey, real quick, before we get into today's video episode or audio, depending on how you're watching or listening, just want to say this up front. This conversation is for informational and educational purposes only. Neither myself nor my guest are providing financial, legal, or tax advice. Everyone's situation is, of course, different, and the tax laws can be complicated and subject to change, so always consult with a qualified professional, whether it's a certified accountant, tax advisor, or legal expert, before making any decisions related to your personal circumstances. We're here just to share general insights, not personalized advice. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Okay, Giovanni, how you doing?
I'm great. Great, Anthony.
Thanks
How are
again
you?
for doing this. I'm doing well. It's finally summer here.
Yeah.
A little warm for me already, a little too warm.
Yeah, I got my AC on for the first time today, so yes, definitely.
Is it pretty common in this part of Italy? We're in central Italy for those listening. What percentage of people do you think have air conditioning? Because I don't have it.
Right. I would say it's increasing because obviously with climate change, it's getting warmer and warmer every year. But
Yeah.
still, it's not that common. And even people that have it don't use it year round. They use it like only when it's extremely hot.
Yeah. Otherwise, they just open the windows. But I
Yeah,
can
exactly.
imagine at work, because you're in your office right now, you
Yeah.
want to have air conditioning because you're there all day and you're probably wearing long sleeves and pants. And
Exactly.
yeah, the
Exactly.
comforts of just wearing what you want make it more difficult. So you're in your office right now, your studio, correct?
Yes, that's right. I'm in me and my dad's office in Perugia. So yeah.
And before we get into the fun tax stuff, which is why we're talking, for the listeners, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're originally from Perugia. You've lived outside of Italy a bit. Can you give us kind of the quick history of Giovanni?
Sure, yeah. First of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I'm Giovanni Cervini. I'm a trainee chartered accountant in Italy. So I'm trying to become a fully qualified commercialista. My background after my high school, after graduating from high school here in Perugia in Italy, I decided to move to London to do my undergraduate degree. And I also did my master's there. I studied economics and then finance. And I actually also worked in London for 3 years. After that, for a number of reasons, including COVID and losing my mom, I decided to move back to Perugia and joining my dad's business. He's a commercialista, so now I'm sort of part of the office and still, obviously retraining to become fully qualified here in Italy. So yeah.
So you're part of the family business now. You're going to continue the legacy.
Correct. Yes. So I'm super excited about that actually. So yeah.
And you're pretty close to being a certified commercialista, correct?
That's right. Yes. In Italy, in order to be a chartered accountant, a dottore commercialista, you need to have an Italian degree, which I'm trying to get, and then you also have to do a traineeship and pass a national exam. And so it's a bit of a process, and I'm close, but still, working on it.
And from going from London to Italy, what do you miss about London?
Well, I think it's not just going from London to Italy, but also going to Perugia, which is quite a small city in Italy. I think definitely I miss the restaurants and the things to do in London. I always say that for 365 days in the year, you can do every day a different thing in London. Perugia is not really the same. So, you tend to always do the same things, meet the same people, go to the same restaurants and so on and so forth. So that's... I think that's the number one thing that I miss of London, and of course all my friends and connections that I have in London.
Because you were there, how many years were you in London?
In total, 7.5. So yeah, it's a long time, but it's not long, super long. But at the same time, it's not. I would say it's not trivial. Yeah.
I mean, it's a long time to plant roots and make good connections, and obviously speak very good English, which you do. You have a very authentic British accent.
Thank you. I pride myself with that, but I think I'm losing that a little bit by moving back to Italy and not speaking that a lot.
Although Perugia is not the worst place to be. It's not Florence. There's not that many foreigners, but it's not, rural Sicily. So you can
No,
find people like me to speak with in English, of course.
exactly.
You're probably the first Italian that's ever said the thing I miss about the UK is the restaurants after having returned to Italy.
Yeah. No, it's not, just English cuisine that you can find in
Sure.
London. So I guess I'm a huge fan of Asian food and Mexican food and, generally, cuisines from all over the world. And I guess I don't have that in Perugia as much as I used to in London. So
Yeah, London you can find everything. You can also find good Italian food because there's so many Italians that moved there and worked there.
exactly. And you could also find, ingredients, good quality ingredients to make Italian food for yourself. So it was a bit of an issue at the beginning, but after a while you kind of go in a rhythm and you start cooking for yourself and you get kind of good at it. So
Yeah,
it's not
especially a city like London with the cost of living, you probably do want to cook for yourself a lot just to save money.
definitely yes.
So I was really excited when we met because you're working towards being a commercialista. You work in a tax and an accountant office with your father, and you've worked with a fair amount of foreigners, expats who've moved to Italy. Obviously, you speaking such good English, I'm sure has a big bonus there. So I wanted to pick your brain a bit because a lot of people come to me asking me about what's it like paying taxes in Italy, and I can tell them what I know about my particular situation, but as you know, everybody's situation is unique and the devil is in the details. So I just wanted to have you on to share some of your expertise working with your father in your studio and how it might help people who are already in Italy or hopefully are preparing to go to Italy and are doing the homework beforehand, because that can get you into some trouble if you don't do the research beforehand and speak to somebody like yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely agree with that. I also confirm that there's a lot of requests for English speaking accountants and consultants in general. So yeah, there's definitely something that it's important, I understand, for expats and people that would like to move to Italy, but are getting sort of interested in the idea.
Yes. So what are some questions that you get? What are the most common mistakes or questions that you get from somebody from the UK or from the US that wants to move to Italy and is preparing?
I think the biggest misconception, or I would say the biggest, let me call it mistake that people do is that they move here, they buy a house, and then only afterwards, maybe, after a year or so, they start thinking, what about taxes? So I think, it's not, unfrequent that clients come to me with this issue. So I would say the best thing that people can do before moving to Italy is to try to understand the impact of taxes, because it can be small, but it can also be quite important. And so it's definitely something to keep in mind, and it's better to almost be proactive about it rather than reactive. So yeah, that's my I would say my number one advice.
Yeah, okay. I totally agree with that. And I did my homework to an extent, but there were questions I didn't ask until after I moved that luckily it all worked out. I didn't get penalized or have any, surprises, but there could have been. And
Right.
I wish there were some questions I asked beforehand just to save myself some stress. One of the biggest questions that I get, I'll try to channel the people that ask me, both they ask me and then also with my business, with my colleague Christina Prejean. She's an attorney. We help people get their Italian citizenship. Of course, people who are interested in citizenship are going to ask questions about taxes. So it kind of comes from both sides, whether it's people just coming to spend some time in Italy as a digital nomad for just a few months, or people who plan on moving to Italy or don't plan on moving to Italy but just want to get their Italian passport. How does that work? So I guess the first and most basic of questions is, how does Italy tax you, and when does it tax you, and who does it tax you? So let's say, for example, I'm an American with Italian ancestry and I get my Italian passport, but I never moved to Italy. I just have the passport so that maybe one day I want to move to Italy, or my kids can move to Italy and maybe retire there, but not for at least 15, 20 years. If I just have my Italian citizenship, do I have to pay taxes?
Short question is no, but it also depends. So the Italian system is based on residency, so fiscal residency. In order to be taxed in Italy, you have to be considered a fiscal resident in Italy, which is a different concept than citizenship. An Italian citizen can be a resident and therefore pay taxes, or move abroad, cannot be a resident and therefore not pay taxes in Italy at all. And vice versa. So someone who doesn't have a citizenship can be considered a fiscal resident in Italy and therefore be liable to pay taxes. Once you are considered a fiscal resident, you are taxed on your worldwide income. So it's a principle that basically all of your income, wherever this may arise from, is taxed in Italy. On top of that, even if you're not a resident in Italy, income that arises from Italy is taxed in Italy. For example, you have a property, you have a house in Italy and you rent it out. That income, because it's basically arising from Italy, is taxed in Italy. Obviously, on top of that, we should be talking about tax treaties and double taxation agreements, but that's another layer that we can discuss.
Yeah, we'll get there. So, okay, so let's say I'm from the United States and I'm not a citizen of Italy. I'm not going to get my passport, but I love Italy so much, and I found all these €1 houses that I see on the news. I can buy a €1 house in southern Puglia, so I can, just be neighbors with a donkey and nobody else. I have a lot of opinions about that system, but it is legit. For those asking, are the €1 houses real? Yes, they are real. You're getting into a lot of work, but it is real. If somebody buys any property in Italy, say it's one of these €1 houses, but any property, and they go there for maybe 2 months a year, and then the rest of the time, they are back in their home country, like the United States, and while they're not there, they rent it out like an Airbnb. I should also say, this is my own opinion, don't do this, please. Don't be one of these people. If you want to buy a house in the middle of nowhere where nobody wants to live anyways, okay, that's fine. But don't go to Florence. Don't come to where we are. Don't come to Perugia and just buy a house because you can pay cash and spend 2 months a year there and then go back and rent it out as an Airbnb for other foreigners, because then you're pricing out the locals and young people who can't afford to live in their own city. So don't do that. But let's pretend you are one of those people doing that. That's my little side rant. Pretend you are one of those people. You don't have residency in Italy, but you do own property, and that property makes you an income. You have to pay taxes on that rental income if it's an Airbnb or something?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So even though you do not classify as a resident, and we can discuss this more because the criteria have changed recently to be considered a fiscal resident. But if you're not a resident, if you're not considered a fiscal resident in Italy, you pay taxes only on the income that's produced in Italy. Therefore, the Airbnb income needs to be taxed in Italy, and therefore you need to declare it and do a tax return and include all the income and pay taxes here. Yeah.
So, okay. I just had a thought that maybe I'll come back to later. A really unique situation that somebody could be in. So, in order, like you just said, the rules have recently changed and what defines fiscal residency in Italy. So, when does somebody become a fiscal resident?
So, in order there's the famous 183 rule that is becoming a bit of a phantom moving around.
Yes.
People are so, worried about spending 182 days in Italy not to overcome this limit, which on one hand is true, but it doesn't paint the full picture. Because the tax office can actually, the rules say that you can be considered a tax resident in Italy, even if you spend less than half of the year, so 183 days in Italy, if your center of vital interests is in Italy. Now, how do you define center of vital interest? We could have a 2-hour conversation about that, but it's basically where your work is, where your family is, if you have any real estate, where your main residency is, and of course, also where you spend most of the time of the year. Yes, what I wanted to stress is that it's not just day counting exercise, but it's a bit more complicated, obviously, because it's Italy.
Sure.
It's a bit more complicated than just counting the days, and it can be quite tricky and also prone to interpretation. One might think that I'm definitely, my center of vital interest is definitely not in Italy. The tax office might argue otherwise, and then you sort of have to escalate things.
So let's say, I'll just pick a few scenarios. Let's say you are an Italian citizen, a dual citizen, so you can be in Italy legally as much as you want. But you are American, so you have an American job that you do, let's say, remotely. All of your bank accounts are American. You have a home to live in the US. Your family's in the US, but you decide, I'm going to spend a year in Italy just enjoying the life, working remotely, legally because you are a citizen of Italy as well. If you only have physical presence in Italy, and let's say you have a house that you rent and you have residency registered with the comune, which technically you have to if you spend that much time. So if you're just physically in Italy, working remotely, but you receive income in US dollars, you're here physically and you have residency in the comune for the whole year, would you be considered, I know it still might not be black or white, but would that person be considered a tax resident of Italy?
To me, yes. Also, it depends on, sort of the tax year. Because if you come from sort of, I don't know, let's say August to July, I think it's different than if you come to January to December. Because the tax year in Italy goes from 1st of Jan to 31st of December. So if you spend the majority of your time, meaning almost like the whole year in Italy, to me, then yes, you're a resident here because the center of vital interest requirement or the criteria is outweighed by the days that you're in Italy.
And would that also, sorry to interrupt, but would it be, so you have the days, obviously you're more than 183 days. Is it also, and I know this, like you said, this changed recently, so I'm thinking 3-4 years ago. There's your domicilio, your domicile.
Yeah.
That also counts because you physically live in Italy.
Exactly. So
Okay.
In the past, there used to be, the past couple of years ago, different requirements. The first one was having residency, so they're being registered to the town hall. And that was the absolute sort of criteria. So if you were registered for more than 6 months, then you were 100% considered a tax resident, no question asked, sort of, no question about it.
Okay.
And then there was domicile, which was physical presence in Italy. But now that has changed. The registration to the town hall is not an absolute criteria anymore. So the domicile and the center of vital interests are.
Okay, that's good to know. That's a big change.
Yeah, and it's taken place from the 1st of January 2024. So it's a couple of years that this has been the case. So.
Okay. What about somebody who, let's say, okay, so the Italy tax year is from January to the end of December, so it's the calendar year, January to December. Let's say you live in the US and you are working a job for 3 or 4 months in the US at the beginning of the year, and then you decide to move to Italy and spend the rest of the year in Italy. So let's say you quit your job and then you move to Italy. And you don't have any more income at that point. You're just living off of savings. But you're in Italy more than 183 days that year. You rent an apartment where you're registered with the comune. And let's say you're on a visa of some, like the digital nomad visa. So first question, would you consider that person a resident of Italy, a fiscal resident of Italy if they spend 8 months of the year?
Yes. I would consider that a resident, especially if the moving to Italy, it's permanent. So it's not something that is sort of, in a sense, temporary, but that this person has quit his job, moved to Italy, set up an apartment, and so on and so forth. So registered to the town hall, has a visa, and so on and so forth. So yes, I would say that person is a resident in Italy. And in fact, because you can be a resident you are a resident for the whole tax year, you need to pay Italian taxes on the income that you made in the US for the first few months of the year. Obviously, with the tax treaties, you won't be paying twice. So you won't be paying taxes both in Italy and in the US. And you can get a foreign tax credit on the taxes that you paid in the US on that income to pay taxes in Italy. But you will definitely have to do a tax return in Italy for that year.
Okay. So you could file, that's interesting to me. You could get a tax credit based on the taxes you paid to the US for those first 4 months of working in the US.
Mm-hmm.
You could then turn to Italy when you file and say, for these 4 months of working in the US, I paid these US taxes, so you could get a credit.
Generally speaking, obviously
Okay.
there's exceptions, and
Okay.
yeah, the mechanism is a bit, more complicated.
Sure.
Effectively, if you had to pay more in Italy, then more taxes in Italy that you had paid in the US, the difference you have to pay in Italy, but you can claim what you paid in the US towards for a credit for Italian taxes.
Okay. Just to underscore that so people know, if you earned money in the US in the first few months of the year before you even set foot in Italy, and then you set foot in Italy and become a tax resident, a fiscal resident in Italy in that same year, Italy will want you to file, and in theory, you should be paying taxes on the money you made outside of Italy even before you moved there because it's in the same year from January to December.
Correct.
Okay, good. I think that would affect a lot of people, and that's something to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry if I may add something.
Yeah, please.
That I would say that applies only once you're moving, because once you're set up here and, for example, you're still working for an American company, but you're a resident here, you're considered a fiscal resident here, in theory, you should ask for the US to not charge you on those taxes, on those income, because you are a resident of Italy and therefore you shouldn't pay taxes in the US. And then, file a tax return here in Italy first, and then file a tax return in the US as a US citizen only after you filed your Italian taxes.
Okay.
So that you don't have to use the foreign tax credit mechanism.
Okay. Yeah, and while we're on that, so for people who do live in Italy or are going to become fiscal residents of Italy, but they're also citizens of the US, for those who don't know, the US taxes its citizens on their worldwide income, regardless of where they live. So the US tax is based on citizenship, Italy tax is based on residency. So if you live in Italy and you settle in Italy, you still have to file in the US every year. You might not pay to the US, but you have to at least file. I've met a surprising number of people who are US citizens who just don't do that. They just don't file. It's like, man, I hope you don't get audited one day. But in that situation, like you just said, just so I understand, somebody's a resident of Italy, they need to handle the Italian taxes first, and then once they've paid Italy, then they go to the US and the US side gets done.
Ideally, yes. And it's not even about paying in Italy first, but it's having the tax return ready.
Okay.
So that in the US, you can sort of have the figures basically, so that you can prepare your tax return in the US. And I know for a fact that that's quite tricky because the deadlines are very far apart. The Italians' deadline are very ahead in the year. Forward in the year. The deadline to submit the tax return is the end of October. To pay, it's the end of June. Pay the first sort of installment. Therefore, you either need to ask your commercialista to try to be quick and do your tax return as soon as possible in order for you to sort of have that ready for when you submit your US tax return. But again, I know, it's not always physically possible to have a tax return, an Italian tax return ready for the beginning of the year, simply because the form is not out yet.
Yes.
And therefore, it's often the case that US citizens need to ask for an extension to the deadline for the US taxes, and that way you can sort of have the timeline sort of in place.
Okay. So the deadlines for Italy, let's say, if we're talking about, let's say let's talk about this year, 2025. Right now it's June. Let's say for taxes for this current year, 2025, what needs to be done? and when?
So for the year 2025, you're going to pay taxes in 2026. Deadline to file the tax return, so to submit the tax return to the tax office, usually is end of October.
Of this year?
Of 2026.
Okay.
So
10 months later, you file.
correct. Yes.
Okay.
So, and that's to sort of file, so submit the tax return.
Okay.
With regards to payment, you pay in usually 2 installments, and these are due. The first one is due at end of June, interestingly. So first you pay and then you file. And the second one is due in end of November.
Okay. How does that explain that? Why do you pay first and then file?
So usually it makes sense because once you sort of are a couple of years that you're filing, the first payment is based on previous year's tax return. So the Italian government wants you to pay sort of ahead, wants you to pay upfront as an advance to your next year taxes. And therefore, the first year, you're basically paying twice as much. So let's use the years because maybe it's easier. In 2025, you move to Italy, you have an income, you need to pay taxes. In 2026, you will pay taxes for 2025, and then the Italian government also asks you for 100% advance on 2026 taxes based on 2025, on an estimate of 2025. Once you get this process going, you're basically paying today for next year's taxes because you have an advance from last year for today's taxes.
Okay. What if somebody has no intentions on staying a second year and they just want to do 1 year?
Well, in theory, you could not pay in advance if that's the intention. Yeah, you can say that there's, an exceptional circumstance and therefore not pay an advance. But again, that's the exception. In theory, if you're a resident here, you're expected to be here for a long time, and therefore they expect you to pay an advance as well.
Okay, so let's say somebody's in Italy for 2025 and they have to pay taxes. 2026, ideally they should get a commercialista, somebody like you or your dad.
Yeah.
And you would tell them this is how much you will pay for the whole year. The first installment is due at the end of June.
Mm-hmm.
The second installment is due in November. And then filing takes place in October. Filing is basically documenting how much you paid, how much you earned.
Exactly. And the filing is not something that my clients needs to do because it's something that is done remotely through the tax office portal. So it's nothing that they need to sort of worry about because it's sort of selected intermediaries and so on and so forth.
Like you, for example.
Yeah,
you
for
would
example.
handle filing. Okay.
Exactly. Rather, I should say my office because I'm not fully
Sure.
qualified
Your
yet.
office, yes.
Yeah, so my dad but while obviously paying, it's something that you need to remember and keep in mind. So yeah, I would say the biggest deadlines are, end of June and end of.
Okay, that's great to know. Okay, so if somebody gets a job in Italy, like just a proper Italian job, maybe they work as a waiter, they work at a bar, they find a job in an office. How does it work with the taxes? Are they, in the US, what we're used to is the taxes are withheld by the employer. Does it work that same way in Italy, or do you earn your full paycheck? You just have to be sure to set money aside to pay taxes at the end of the year.
No, so if you're an employee, your employer will withhold taxes for you. And in fact, most employees in Italy do the so-called 730, like 730, which is a separate form. It's like a simplified version of the standard tax return. And that's for sort of pensioners and employees that have sort of a usual situation. However, foreigners often need to do sort of standard tax return and not a simplified one because of their foreign assets, investments, real estate that needs to be declared in the tax return. And this can be done only in the sort of standard tax return and not in the simplified version. So if you come to Italy and start working, as you said, as a waiter or whatever, basically being an employee, you could only sort of file a 730, However, it also depends on your sort of the rest of your situation. So, for example, do you have properties in the US or everywhere else in the world? Do you have investments outside of Italy? Do you have a pension scheme? Do you have financial assets, crypto, for example? So it's not a yes or no
I see. I see.
answer, as most things, to be honest. With
Yes, of course.
with Italian
That's
tax.
that's why people pay your office to help with
Yeah.
this kind of stuff, because it can get complicated. Okay, so how about for just one last thing about double taxation, because people often ask, of course, if they move to Italy and now they know that the U.S. taxes on worldwide income and they have to report every year to the U.S. even if they don't live there. If they're making money in Italy, the question is, do they also have to pay in the U.S.? And we're not tax specialists in the U.S. We always recommend, I'm sure you do as well, I recommend have a tax specialist in the U.S. and not just an accountant, but an accountant who has worked with people who have left the U.S., because there's different ways that you can save. For example, there's the foreign earned income exclusion. Also, the foreign tax credit, I think, is one where you can basically prove if you, again, it depends on where you have residency and everything, but it's something like if you're out of the U.S. for 330 days, or if you can prove that you were a tax resident elsewhere in the world, then you get a credit and you don't have to pay taxes on the U.S. And it depends on the situation. I think right now the foreign earned income exclusion is up to $120,000 a year is non-taxable if you are a tax resident outside of the U.S. So there, and then there's the tax treaties, which you know about, that kind of will do tiebreakers between the two countries if you have citizenship in the U.S. but you live in Italy, or you're a citizen of both countries. So there's ways to not be double taxed. Just do your homework, and more importantly, speak to somebody, because there's ways to do it right and there's ways to do it wrong. Anything I missed there?
No, absolutely. I subscribe to what you said. I think from my perspective, obviously, I'm working on the Italian side of things, and I often advise, I always advise people to get an accountant also on the US side or wherever they're from. So, because again, certain things I'm not an expert of, and I cannot give an opinion about it. It's important to have a confidence on both sides of the equation, and so it's important that you also have an expert, as have someone to help you doing Italian taxes. You also do other country. We mentioned the tiebreaker rules, right?
We mentioned it. How do the tiebreaker rules work?
So the tax treaties effectively means that you cannot be taxed twice on the same income. So in order to understand where you're taxed, you also need to understand where you're a resident and where you're considered a fiscal resident. In some cases, you can be considered a resident in two countries at the same time, according to the national rules. So with the US, it's often the case, because obviously, if you're a citizen, you're also considered sort of a fiscal resident, and therefore need to pay taxes in the US. And that's where the tiebreaker rules come into place. And those are basically an order of criteria that basically helps to obviously break ties in residency, and helps you understand in which country you're a resident, and therefore in which country you should pay taxes. Then, usually they follow, the same order, because there's a tax treaty that follows a template, but sometimes they may vary based on the bilateral agreements between countries. They are very often used for American citizens who live in Italy, who are residents in Italy, because they need to understand where to file, or essentially if they need to file in Italy or not.
Okay. And that treaty is what, from 1999? It's like Article 4, 1999, if I remember correctly. Because I remember looking at it over and over again.
Something like that, yeah. They are very old. Some are newer, like with some countries that have been updated recently, But yeah, I think with the US and with the UK as well, those are extremely old. But somehow they still work. So
Yes, and there's all kinds of Facebook groups out there where people can give their input and their opinion about when you pay and when you don't, and that's all fine and good, but they're not professionals usually, and it's just an overwhelming amount of information. So I highly recommend spending a few $100s up front on consultations with a professional on both sides of the pond can save you thousands in mistakes in the future. So it's worth getting it right from the beginning.
absolutely.
For people who are, for example, retirees in pension that want to move to Italy and retire, I get asked a lot. Let's just assume they pick up residency in Italy, they become fiscal residents. Do they have to pay taxes on their retirement income from the US, assuming it all comes from the US?
It depends. So this sort of links back to the tax treaties and the agreements against double taxation. So the principle is that you shouldn't be taxed on the same income twice, so by two different countries. With pensions, the general rule is that if a pension is a public pension, so it comes from the state, the government, or a similar entity, it can only be taxed in the country where it's coming from. So, for example, if you have a pension from, I don't know, the US military, for example, this can only be taxed in the US.
For us, yeah, or it would be like Social Security is a government, kind of a
Yeah.
government pension.
Right, but Social Security is the exception to the rule, because Social Security has its own sort of article in the tax treaty.
Fantastic.
Yes, and Social Security is taxed in the country where you reside. Therefore, it's only taxed in Italy.
Okay.
So you need to basically make sure that you're not taxed for Social Security in the US.
Okay.
If you're a resident here, considered a fiscal resident, so on and so forth. And private pensions are, again, taxed here in Italy only. Bit, again, it's quite tricky because Social Security, you think it's, a public government pension, but in fact, it's treated as if it was a private pension.
Okay.
This is the general rule and the rule that applies to the US and Italy treaty. Other countries, most of the countries follow a standardized format in the treaties because they're obviously the bilateral treaties. But this is sort of the generalized version, general rule. There might be exceptions for other countries, but yeah, this is the general.
Okay. And then what about if somebody from the US has a 401k, so an employer investment account that they can withdraw from once they've retired? That would be taxable in Italy?
Yes.
Okay.
What you withdraw from that account is taxed in Italy, and similarly to IRAs and stuff. This is, again, I know that there's loads of 401ks and loads of IRAs, and
yes.
So generally speaking, this is the case, but then obviously case by case can be different.
Okay. Yeah, because in the US we have the traditional IRA, which you pay taxes on when you withdraw, or there's the Roth IRA, which you pay taxes on when you add to it, and you don't pay taxes on it when you withdraw. So that could be interesting. And then I'm assuming just a standard investment account, so a mutual fund separate from an employer. Mutual funds or just private stocks, when people sell those off, I think that probably all just gets put in capital gains if you're taking dividends and living off that while you're in Italy.
Correct. So on one hand, you're taxed on the income. So you're taxed on capital gains, interests, dividends earned on these instruments, these investments. And the tax rate is 26% for all of these three categories. On the other hand, you also have a wealth tax, which is IVAFE, it's called, and it's a wealth tax on financial assets held abroad, and it's 0.2% of the value of the investments at the end of the year, so at 31st of December. And, I want to add something that sometimes people ask me, is it better if I move all my investments to Italy so I don't pay this IVAFE tax, this wealth tax? And I say, no, because Italians pay this tax as well on their investments, but it's withdraw, from the bank directly. And so you don't, sort of pay out of pocket, but you effectively, pay it nonetheless.
Okay.
So it's not sort of a discrimination against.
It's not a foreign wealth tax. It's a wealth tax that everybody pays.
Everybody pays. Simply, it has a different name for assets held abroad because the bank doesn't withdraw it automatically from your bank account, essentially. But everybody pays it.
Okay. So that would be the wealth tax would be any how do I want to phrase this? You can tell I'm not a finance person. I'm an engineer. Sorry. Any accounts that you have, whether it's a savings account or an investment account, the balance, you would pay the wealth tax on that. Or crypto would be in that category. If it's something you have that you have not sold, it's just sitting there, that's what the 0.2% applies to.
It applies to investment accounts, so brokerage accounts, mutual funds, so on and so forth. Bank accounts, sort of regular bank accounts, you don't get taxed at 0.2%, but you get taxed at a flat 34.20 euro flat fee. If it's above 5,000, on average during the year. Basically, on investments, you're taxed at this 0.2%. On normal, regular bank accounts, you're taxed at 34 euros flat.
Okay. So somebody could ask, I've heard about all these tax incentive regimes in Italy. Can I come to Italy and pay low taxes? And how do I do that?
Well, there's a number of incentives that sort of were born to answer to different sort of problems or issues that we have in Italy. The first one is the scheme for retirees moving to southern Italy, to towns and villages that have less than, I think it's 20,000 citizens. Basically, those people pay a flat tax of 7% on their pension and all of their income. That's obviously quite good considering the standard tax rates in Italy. Obviously, you have to be willing to move to a tiny village in the south of Italy. It's quite interesting. The second scheme is the Impatriati scheme. The ratio behind this tax break was to attract so Italians and foreigners, but mostly Italians that moved from Italy, highly skilled people that moved, like were educated in Italy, but moved abroad to work. There have been different versions of this scheme. And the most recent one has sort of tightened the leash on the tax break. So he has reduced the reduction in taxes, and he also has reduced the years that you can benefit from this scheme, and also has increased the criteria that you need to meet to benefit from this scheme. So currently, if you're highly skilled, which means, if I'm not mistaken, you need to have a master's degree or above, or sort of a work qualification that makes you basically highly skilled, and you need to have lived abroad for a number of years. In these cases, you can benefit from a 50% reduction in your tax base. So now your tax rate by your tax base is halved, basically, for 5 years. In the past, it used to be a bigger reduction, and also you had the option to make it last for 10 years instead of 5. But currently, those are the two biggest tax breaks for foreigners who wants to move to Italy.
And the regime impatriati is for Italian citizens who left and came back?
No, not necessarily. It's people that resided abroad outside of Italy.
I see.
For a number of years. So obviously there's a requirement for Italians. If I'm not mistaken, it's like 2 years. So you had to be resident outside of Italy for 2 years. But I need to double. I might be mistaken.
That definitely sounds familiar to me. I think I'm also almost positive the 7% has that. You can't have lived in Italy for 2 years prior.
The impatriati is a bit of a mess because there've been so many versions, and the criteria have been changing all the time, and it's it's difficult to remember all of them on top of my head. And so it applies to basically Italians and non-Italians that move to Italy.
Okay.
Essentially. And in fact, sorry if I may add, I am an impatriati myself.
I was going to say.
Yes, I benefited from the scheme, having lived outside of Italy for a number of years. When I moved back, I was considered an impatriati. And and therefore I'm benefiting from not the current version, but the previous one because I moved in 2023.
Yeah, for the 7%, I think it applies to Puglia, Molise, Calabria, Basilicata, Campania, Sicily, and Sardinia.
I think so. I think
maybe Abruzzo as well.
Yeah, I don't remember if Abruzzo is included or not. Definitely Lazio is not included. Yeah, anything north of that is not included. But yeah, it's not just moving to one of those regions. It's also moving to a village, basically, a town with less than 20,000 citizens.
Yes, which is small.
Yeah.
For comparison's sake, just for people to have an idea, 20,000 citizens would be, if they've been, I'm trying to think of a place in Italy that everybody knows that's smaller. Lucca is probably 80,000 people, if I had to guess, probably 80 to 100,000. Foligno, for those familiar with Foligno, which is nobody, is 40,000. So half the size of that, and old and hot. That's where you'll be living, but you get 7%. So I'm curious how close. I'm gonna fact check my Lucca population guess. Lucca,
I'm thinking maybe
94,000 estimated in 2025. In 2021, it was 83,000. I said 80, so I wasn't too far off. Okay, so yeah, imagine Lucca, a quarter the size of Lucca, and not nearly as clean, but really charming. I mean, the further south you get in Italy, the cooler and more authentic and raw and real it gets. So it has its charm, and I love it. Living there is different, but it depends on what you're looking for. And they could also qualify if they got a €1 house in those regions. It's for a certain type of person. If they want to live that lifestyle, then have at it, and then they should talk to you.
Absolutely. It's a good opportunity, I think. If you're okay with that, and you know what you're what you're going sort of towards, I think it's a great scheme.
Okay, so a few more questions here. One I just thought of. What is a Codice Fiscale, and does it mean I'm paying taxes if I get one? Because it sounds like it.
No. It is a tax code. But it's also an identification code. So it has your date of birth. It has your sort of some letters of your first name and last name. And it also says where you were born, what city in Italy or what state outside of Italy. So it's a tax code, but it's also used for everything in Italy. It's definitely needed if you want to move here, but even if you want to temporarily live here, it's something that is quite useful and it's quite easy to get. You won't be considered a tax resident in Italy only because you have a tax code.
Okay, there you heard it, folks. And if you're gonna come, like you said, if you're gonna come to Italy for 3 months, let's say if there's any, I don't know if there's any, study abroad students that are 40 minutes into a talk about Italian taxes. But if you're going to come to Italy for 2 months to do an Erasmus or a study abroad and you want to have an Italian SIM card so you can use data here that's a lot cheaper than the US, you need a Codice Fiscale to get an Italian SIM card. You need it for basically anything. Yeah. And you can get it through your consulate, and I don't remember the fee to get it, but it's not that expensive. And it takes a couple months, so plan ahead if you do it in the consulate.
Yeah, and we can actually get Codice Fiscales as well.
Okay.
It's, for us, usually, generally speaking, it takes a couple of days it's mostly about the tax office to reply to us.
Okay.
That's why it can take a bit of time, but yeah, it's quite.
So if I'm in the US,
yeah,
and I need a Codice Fiscale, can I call you and say, can you get me this?
Yes, but also you also need to have an Italian domicile.
Okay.
So kind of semi-permanent abode where you live. So you don't need to own the place, or you don't need to be there year round. But you need to have sort of a base in Italy in order to add a Codice Fiscale, yeah. Okay,
so if you're abroad, I would say go to your consulate. If you're in Italy, call somebody like Giovanni if you need it. I've met people who are here and they're in a rush and I need a Codice Fiscale and I'm struggling.
Yeah.
And to do it on their own can be kind of a headache, so to have somebody to call would be helpful. Great, so if somebody wants to reach out to you, where can they find your office?
So we are based in Perugia. The best way to reach us is through our website. It's cervinigrasselli.com, and they can email me directly at giovanni.cervini@studiocervinigrasselli.it. I know it's a lot of...
But I'll put that in the show notes. I'll make that visible for people.
Yeah, it's...
If somebody they just wanted to talk to you remotely, like maybe they're not moving to Italy for 6 more months, could you do a video consultation?
Absolutely, absolutely. I've done that before, and I can fully work remotely. Some of our clients I've never met, apart from call similar to this one. So it's not a requirement to come to the office in Perugia.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this, Giovanni. This was a really informative call and really helpful for everybody, I'm sure.
Thank you for having me. It was so much fun and a great pleasure. Even though the topic is often a bit dry, but
dry, but it's important, man. It's one of those things that people would rather not worry about. So get it right at the beginning.
100%.